Well, Jeff's a little taller than I am. I'm going to adjust that just a little bit. He mentioned their time in Robert Lee. They went to church in Robert Lee. They didn't live in Robert Lee. They lived out on a ranch. About I don't know how many miles was that. 21 miles west of Robert Lee. And I remember going out to their house, and he had this great big old plastic barrel, and you could kick that barrel and it'd start rattling. He had rattlesnakes in that barrel. That's how he made a little extra money, collect snakes. I don't know if he still collects snakes or not, but he used to collect snakes. That may have been on his resume somewhere. I don't know, at some point. I thank you for the opportunity to think with you this evening about the home and in general, and then specifically about preparing for marriage. I would echo what Jeff said. I think that's a vital thing. It's very important. And that's kind of the way I've come to think about the going and speaking somewhere and they assign you something it's an invitation to think about things maybe you hadn't thought about for a while, or maybe you hadn't thought about it all for a while. I've thought about this before, but not in a while, and I appreciate the invitation to think with you this evening about preparing for marriage. The first thing I would say is that someone is going to teach our children. Someone is going to teach our teens. Someone even is going to teach our single adults, rightly or wrongly. Somebody's going to teach them. Now, it may be that what's teaching them are songs on the radio, and they may be taught by movies, or they may be taught by the internet or television, but somebody's going to teach. And the reason, that's why I think it's important to talk about this, because if we vacate the field, somebody's going to fill the gap there. And at least it's important for us to be able to counter influences that I think are ungodly influences in a lot of ways. And not only do we want to counter those things, but I think we also, in preparing people for marriage, I think it's important that we stress the joys of marriage. And that we stress not just the dangers, there are certainly dangers, but how wonderful it is to marry a godly person. And to think about the fact that you're aligning yourself with God's purposes for human beings in a good marriage. Now, preparation is required in all sorts of situations, if you stop and think about it. We want our plumbers, if they're going to work on our house, we want them to be prepared, don't we? To know what they're doing. If we need an electrician, we want the electrician to know what they're doing. They've done some preparation. They're not going to come to my house and say, "Now, Greg, what do you think about if I do it this way? Would that fix it?" That is a fruitless question to ask me about electrical things. I want someone who's prepared. Teachers. My undergrad degree is in elementary education. I taught school 2 years, and that preparation was helpful, although I will say where I really learned how to teach was I finished at midterm and I substituted for a semester. You learn lots of things if you substitute. And in some ways, that's where I really learned how to teach. But architects, we want architects to know what they're doing. I saw the sign out here. If you get your roof done, you want a roofer that knows what they're doing. They've prepared. Doctors, 3 weeks ago, yesterday, we had to put down a rebellion by my appendix. And it's been banished from my body. I went back, had a follow-up visit with the surgeon yesterday, and they said, looks pretty good, but you can't still lift over but 10 pounds for another 10 days. So there I am. But I'm glad that there are people that know how to cut you, if you need to be cut. And I needed to be cut. And so I'm glad that there was a doctor that was prepared. We've got a young lady that when she was a little girl, she was a member at North A when her family lived there, and then they moved away. She showed up again about a year ago, and she's doing her rotations for medical school at Tech Medical School. So she's a member of our church again now. And I asked her a while back about like going to eat with us one time on a Sunday, and she said, nope, I have to go study because they're going to give me a test. And I told her, you know what, we'd enjoy having you eat with us, but when I go to a doctor, I want them to know what they're doing. So I think it's a good thing you're going to go study. Think about driver's ed. When is the ideal time for driver's ed? If you're looking at this page, here's 3 options. One is before the person ever sits at the wheel. And that's important preparation, isn't it? You talk about what the laws are, what you need, what speeds you should travel at certain places, and how to operate the vehicle. And yet, that's not enough, because at some point, you're going to need to sit actually in the car with a teacher, and you're the student driver, and the coach that was my driver's ed teacher, who was also coaching golf at the time at Seminole. So what he would do was have us drive. I don't know if you know where Gaines County Park is, but we'd drive from Seminole to Gaines County Park so he could check the greens out there. And then we would drive back to Seminole. But the thing I remember is there was a brake pedal on the right side. Now, why did they do that? He wasn't real sure I was prepared. If worse comes to worse, we can stop this vehicle if you cannot. But then, so when's the best time to prepare? Well, probably the worst time to prepare is after. What if the person drives and they're in a wreck, and then you say, well, let's do some preparation. The preparation should have gone on a little bit before that. Or here's a question from the viewpoint of heaven: which is more important? That you can safely operate an automobile? I think that's important. Or that you get married? From the viewpoint of heaven, how important is that? Or that you know how to drive a car as you leave on your honeymoon after you got married? Well, I think all of those are important, but I think you would agree with me that second one is the most important, isn't it? And that is, from the viewpoint of heaven, it's a lot more important when you get married and who you marry and how you're going to live as a married person than your ability to drive a car. And yet, do we require some preparation before you can drive a car? And if marriage is much more important than driving a vehicle, shouldn't it make sense that you do some preparation before you get married? And so, when do you prepare? I want to suggest to you, and here's 2 blanks to fill in. Some people like to fill in blanks, so here's 2 blanks you can fill in. The ideal time to prepare for marriage is before getting married. Now, you can do some good with people that are already married that need some help. But the ideal time to prepare for marriage is when you're a child, or when you're a teen, or when you're a single adult. And the preparation that you do is sometimes it's formal preparation. And what I mean by that is it's purposeful teaching. I mean, that's what this summer is about, isn't it? Purposeful teaching about the home. And the idea of teaching from Scripture. What does Scripture say about marriage? And what are biblical principles that you can apply in marriage? And there's also practical preparation. And Jeff touched on this a little bit. And that is, there is a lot of preparation that I had for marriage that nobody said a word. It's what I saw. It's what I saw sometimes, like when my parents are great people. They're still alive. My mother's 90, my dad's 92. They still love each other. They're kind to each other. But I can remember times in our life together where there was a little friction there. There was some disagreement. And you know what that taught me? What that taught me was that disagreement is not a disaster. That you can be a follower of Jesus and disagree about something and still not be disagreeable, and still love each other and still hang in there, even if you have some differences. And so there's some practical teaching that goes on, and you know, it's not just church leaders that do that teaching. It's parents by their example, it's grandparents by their example, it's Christian brethren by their example, that they model what marriage looks like, what God's idea of marriage. In fact, I would say that all of the formal teaching may not be very helpful if you don't also see it in practice. And you think about that, really, Christian marriage is about discipleship, about following Jesus as you are married to this spouse. And that person, ideally, is a disciple of Jesus. And I invite you to look with me at 1 Corinthians 13. You may remember that it's kind of a short chapter, but it's the chapter, it's kind of interesting. Chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians talks a lot about spiritual gifts. Chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians talks a lot about spiritual gifts. And if you look back at chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, you are lacking no spiritual gifts. But you know what they are lacking at Corinth? They're lacking what he talks about in chapter 13. And that's why chapter 13 is sandwiched on either side by talk about spiritual gifts. They got plenty of spiritual gifts, but they don't have the most important gift. And that is the gift of love. And I love this passage in chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, because it helps you get a picture of what does it really look like to love somebody. It's not just your emotions. It's not just your feelings. It's a commitment to do what's right by that person, no matter how you feel. And so, if you remember chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, verse 4, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast, nor is it arrogant or rude. And it does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So what I've been talking about to this point is the why prepare. But I want to also talk this evening about, give you some ideas what, if you're going to be preparing someone, helping someone prepare for for marriage, or if you're preparing for marriage, that here, there are other passages we could look at, but here are passages that I would suggest you ought to include in talking about marriage. When I was preaching in Robert Lee, and I was new at preaching, and I knew a good man over in Brant to the east, and he asked me if I would do a wedding for his nephew. I said, okay. And so we didn't really do any preparation. We did the wedding, and I heard about 3 months later that was over. That marriage was over. And I determined right then that from now on, from that point onward, I would refuse to do a wedding unless those people agreed, whether it was with me or someone else, that they did some marriage preparation. And I pretty well held to that. I made an exception about 15 years ago because there was this widow and a widower, and it's pretty clear they knew what they were getting into. I mean, the marriage preparation I'm talking about is where you try to cover lots of different areas of life so there's you reduce the number of surprises you have after you get married. Any of y'all have any surprises after you got married? You thought it was going to be one way and it wasn't? But if you do some preparation, one of the things you can do is at least reduce the number of surprises after you get married. So the back of your page there is really what I want to spend the rest of our time on, and that is I just want to talk about some of these passages of Scripture. That these are some things that if you are preparing to get married, or if you're wanting to assist someone to prepare when they get married, I would suggest you may want to take a look at these passages. Just read them. Talk about them. If you look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 24, let's look at that. Genesis chapter 2. This comes right along after the in the beginning, chapter 1. And there's kind of a retelling, coming at it from a different angle, the creation in chapter 2. And in chapter 2, verse 21, so God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. When you listen to that passage, there's some bad arithmetic. 1 plus 1 equals 1. That's not very good arithmetic, but it is excellent theology. God says 1 plus 1 when it comes to marriage is 1. One flesh. There's some mystery there, isn't there? And yet there's some real truth. One of the things that I do when I work with people as they're preparing to marry, Cindy always helps me, by the way, and she is a great help when we meet with couples like that. But one of the things that I assign them between two of the meetings is between that time and the next meeting, I want them to talk about when they would ever divorce. And I've had some of them say, wait, I'm here to talk about getting married, not getting divorced. Why do you want me to talk about it? Here's why I think that's important. you cannot simply assume that the other person thinks the way you do. And I think it is important to challenge them to talk about that. Because 1 + 1 = 1 is saying you don't go into marriage with a parachute. You don't enter into marriage with the idea that I'm going to try this, and if it doesn't work, I've got a parachute and I can bail out. It's the idea that what I hope couples come to the conclusion that they come to is if we have problems, we're going to work through that. I had a man who did a lot of counseling. He was an elder, and he did a lot of counseling with people that had troubled marriages. And one of the things he told me one time, he said, if two people are committed to that marriage, they can work through almost any problem. I remember reading about Cortez when he came to the coast of Mexico as a conqueror. Like that or not, that's why he did. And he came there as a conqueror, and you know what he did? He burned his ships. Why do you burn your ships when you've invaded? What did that tell his men? No retreat. We're here, and we're going to stick with this. We're not backing off of this. When I do a marriage ceremony, one of the things I do in a marriage ceremony is I talk to the audience. And I tell them, you are here today as witnesses. And the purpose of witness is that if ever there is any doubt about what is decided that day, a witness has the duty to say, wait, I was there and I heard you make a commitment. That's what witnesses are for. So I challenge those who come to a wedding. This is not just a festival. This is not just a joyful occasion. It is that. But you are also here when you attend a wedding. You're there as a witness to hear some vows. And if you see those folks backing away from those vows, the role of a witness is to say, wait, I was there and I heard you make some commitments. 1 + 1 = 1. Another passage I would invite you to consider is Hebrews 13, and that should say verse 4, not 14. Sorry. Hope you got something to mark that one out with. Hebrews chapter 13, 1 through 5 is kind of a thumbnail sketch of what Christian life looks like. It's kind of interesting. You come to the end of what I think is a sermon. You come to the end of a sermon, and the writer of Hebrews says, now just let me remind you what it looks like to live like a follower of Jesus. And included in that is what he says in verse 4. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, where God will judge the fornicator, the sexually immoral, and adulteress. Let marriage be held in honor. One of the things that struck me in looking at these passages is that at least 3 of these passages I listed that talk about the idea of honor in marriage. This is one of those. That marriage is an honorable thing, and you should be honorable in your life together in marriage. And it's interesting that translation there, it's pretty consistent. I looked it up again today, and almost every translation uses the phrase marriage bed. That is what you call a euphemism. A euphemism is where you use one word because if you use what it's really talking about, that's kind of delicate. kind of personal. Marriage bed is not literally talking about the bed, it's what occurs on that bed. The Greek word that's translated from is spelled Koite, koite. There is an English term that comes from that, coitus. It's talking about sexual congress, coming together sexually. And the writer of Hebrews says, for Christians, coming together sexually as husband and wife is an honorable thing. It is a good gift. Like other good gifts from God, it can be abused. It can be corrupted. It can be profaned. But it is a good gift. Sexual relationships in marriage, I think we need to be saying this, are is honorable. The sexual relationship between husband and wife is not something that Satan threw in when God was looking the other way. God invented the idea of sex. And we need to say that. I think we need to be saying that because we live in a culture that is a sex-saturated culture, and much of what is said is incorrect. And I think it's really important to say that and to be saying that. Another passage that I would point you to is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. When you look at 1 Thessalonians, one of the things that's important to do is write a note for yourself to go back and read Acts 17, 1 through 10. In Acts 17, 1 through 10, that's the context for 1 Thessalonians, and that's why you're going to find something in 1 Thessalonians you don't find in other letters of Paul. If you go back and read Acts chapter 17, 1 through 10, Paul is not able to stay at this new missionary church as long as he wants to. The magistrate forces the brethren at Thessalonica to put up what today we would call a peace bond. He forces them to put some money up, and if there's any more disturbance, they will forfeit their bond. And I think there's a little bit of humor in this, because in verse 10, right after that happens, the brethren say to Paul, I think it's time for you to leave town. Why? They don't want to lose their money. They don't want to take a risk that they will lose the peace bond. And so here's how that plays out in 1 Thessalonians. Paul writes this not long after he leaves. I'm pretty well convinced. I think this is probably the earliest letter of Paul that we have in the Bible. He writes it not very long after the events that we read in Acts chapter 17. And one of the things that tells you that that's what's going on, and the thing to watch for in 1 Thessalonians, he will keep saying over and over again throughout the letter, you know this. You recall this. You remember this. You don't find that in his other letters. What's going on there? Paul is saying in 1 Thessalonians what he would like to still be saying in person if he could be there. You remember there was a publication, I haven't seen it in a while, there was a publication that was pretty common that you would give to new Christians. It was called Now That I'm a Christian, Leroy Brownlow. You may remember that. I heard someone talk about 1 Thessalonians like this, and they said, you know what? That's the first century Now That I'm a Christian. That's what 1 Thessalonians is. Now that I'm a Christian, how do I live? That's what you're finding. That's what you're hearing in 1 Thessalonians. And the reason I wanted to point that out is look at chapter 4. If you look at verses 2 through 8, it's another one of those thumbnail sketches of what it looks like to live as a Christian. What does a Christian life look like in practical ways? And in particular, look at verse 4, chapter 4, verse 4. In fact, go back to verse 3 where he says, For this is the will of God, your sanctification, your holiness, that you abstain from, yours may say, fornication, sexual immorality. Fornication, just any kind of sex outside of marriage. Verse 4, that each one of you know how to control his own, literally the word there is vessel. And I think that's another euphemism. That's another roundabout way of talking about a person, and some translations will translate it there, body. Control your body. That these new Christians are needing to be reminded that God's expectation is that you can and should control your impulses, your desires, your body. That you should control your body in holiness and honor. There's that word honor again. You should be honorable before you are married. You should live a life of self-control before you are married, as well as afterward. That you should, I think that's important for us to be saying to our folks. That God's expectation is that you will live a life of honor and holiness. That God's called us to that in Christ Jesus. 4 more passages. All of these are what are sometimes referred to as the household codes of Scripture. 3 of them by Paul, 1 by Peter. In the ancient world, there were any number of philosophers who would produce writings in which they talked about what a family ought to look like. A lot of times what they said was very different than what Paul or what Peter will say. But Paul and Peter follow that same form in talking about, so husbands, here's how you should live. Wives, here's how you should live. Children, here's how you should, fathers and mothers, servants, the ancient household, that line by line, here's how you should live. Here's some practical things to think about and how you should live. And you find that in Ephesians 5, 22 through 26, through 6:9. Colossians 3, 18 through 4:1. Titus 2, 1 through 10. And 1 Peter 2, 18 through 3:7. These are all what are referred to by scholars a lot of times as the household codes. What is the code you live by as a Christian family? And all of these have some things to say about marriage, about husbands, about wives. If you look at Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 22, notice he starts off, wives, you should submit. Husbands, you should love. And I just want you to notice who gets the most attention here. One verse, wives, submit. Husbands, he goes on and says, I want to point you to Jesus. When I say you should love your wife, your model for that is Jesus and the church. That the love that I'm talking about is a self-giving love. It's the sort of love that you give up what's best for yourself for the good of others. That's what led Jesus to die for the cross, for the church. And husbands, Jesus is your model. The love of Jesus for the church is your model for how you would love your wife. And if you notice chapter 5, verse 33, he comes back to wives again and husbands. It's the little summary verse, verse 33 of chapter 5. Here's his summation. But notice how much time he spends telling husbands, you need to love that woman. And you need to love her more than you love yourself. I don't know about you, but I think that might not be a bad message to still be heard in our world. Chapter 6, verse 1 of Ephesians, children, parents. Chapter 6, verse 5, servants, masters. I knew a man that was a really good elder years and years ago. It's when I was teaching school, actually, in Lubbock area. He did a lot of counseling with couples that were struggling. And I remember he told me one time about this couple. They were actually older, but they were struggling. It wasn't sure it was going to last. And he said he was counseling with them, and they read Ephesians 5 together, and the husband said, well, I'll tell you what, she won't submit. And this good man said, did God tell you to enforce that on her? What did God tell you to do as a husband? It's between her and God whether she will submit to you, because you can't separate your relationship with each other as a husband and wife from your relationship with God. It's between her and God whether she submits to you. But what God's told you clearly is you should love her. He said the guy got quieter. I think that was an important point. How hard is it for a woman to submit to a husband if he'll love her like Christ loved the church? Colossians 3:18 through 4:1 is a lot like Ephesians, a lot of similarities. Wives submit, husbands love. And notice in Colossians 3:19, he specifically says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh. In other words, be gentle. Be a gentleman in your marriage. Titus chapter 2, 1 through 10. Paul uses the phrase in chapter 2, verse 1 of Titus, sound doctrine. That word sound is a medical term. The Greek word that's translated sound there is the same word that we get our word hygiene from. Healthy. A good translation of that would be healthy teaching. But as for you, teach what fits with healthy teaching. If you read this letter, there were a lot of unhealthy ways of living on the island of Crete. And here's Titus, and he's got a limited amount of time. If you read the final chapter, Paul says you've got till winter, and that's all that you've got left there. So you need to be sure that you do the things I've told you to do before you leave. Teach what fits with healthy teaching. What healthy teaching he's talking about, what sound doctrine he's talking about, is he talks to older men and older women and younger women and younger men and servants, and he talks to Titus himself. And he says, here are some specific ways that you should be living your lives. One of the interesting things that ties all of this together is a Greek word, sophronos, sophronos. In each one of these groups that he addresses, that is included in that. I missed that for a long time because when it comes to the older women, it doesn't say they should have that in their character, but a verb form of that noun shows up there. Where it says, train the young women, that is a verb form of the word sophronos. Sophronos is the idea that you stop and you think before you do something. And by the way, and this is another place where there's some humor in the Bible. Look at verse 6. Everybody else, older men, older women, younger women, have a multiple things that Paul says. You know what he says to young men? Count how many he says to young men. 1. If we can get the young guys to just do this one thing, sophronos, stop and think before you do something. We'll be way down the road if we can get these young guys to be doing that. There might be something to latch on to today about that. 1 Peter chapter 2, we'll be done just shortly. Chapter 2, verses 18 through 3:7. One of the interesting things about this is who he addresses first. Almost in every other case, it's the servants who are last on the list. Who's first on this one? Servants. Chapter 2, 18. Chapter 2, 18 through 20, servants are addressed first, and I think it's because you have in chapter 2, 21 through 25, a meditation on the same passage that the Ethiopian eunuch was reading when Philip heard him. Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. If you go back and read that passage, there's a bunch of words in that passage that will show up in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 25. It's a meditation on that passage that Philip began at that passage. If you remember in the book of Acts, he began at that passage and shared the good news with the eunuch. Chapter 3, 1 through 6, wives, a lot of verses for wives there. I think it's because there were wives in the first century that became Christians, but their husband didn't. And I say that because if you read there, verse 1, he will say, you know, your behavior as a wife may in fact win that husband without words. It will make an impression on him so that he will be ready to know about Jesus because of your life, he says. Chapter 3, verse 7, husbands, here's how you should treat your wife. You who are Christian husbands, here's how you should treat your wife. And that word honor shows up again. You see that? Treat your wife with honor. Why? Because if you dishonor your wife, you cannot separate your relationship with her from your relationship with God, and it will hinder your prayers. God may decide He doesn't want to listen to you if you dishonor your wife. Sunday afternoons, almost every Sunday afternoon, I go read the Bible with a couple from our church. About 10 or 12 years ago, I taught her, she was a single mother, and I taught her, she had a young son, and she was baptized. About 5 years ago, she got married, and now they've got a 3-year-old boy. Both of them came from families where it was a wreck. There wasn't father and mother in that home. It was a wreck. We've read through the Gospel of Mark. We've read through Genesis. We've read through Exodus. We're about to finish James. We read the Bible and we talk about it, but one of the things we also do fairly often is I talk to them about being married. And I tell them, you have a chance to change your family tree. They have their struggles. But I tell them, even these two young men need to see you struggle. But hang in there. And you're teaching them. When you hang in there. When you don't give up. You're helping prepare that son that she had before she married. He graduated from high school last month. And now this little 3-year-old boy. I have hope for those two young men. Because this husband and this wife keep plugging away and staying in there and not giving up. They're preparing those two young men for marriage. It may be that you need to respond in a public way to the Lord's invitation. If we can assist you as